Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we're going to be addressing the question of the 2019 year of return for the 400-year commemoration. That year of return would be returning to Africa in concert with the Joseph Project, which was spearheaded from Ghana. And that was spearheaded actually a few years ago. We're also going to look at the African Union's request for investments, bank investments, credit union investments from the diaspora to the tune of approximately $1.2 billion per year for projects and investments. And finally, we're going to look at the issue of population transfers. That would be population transfers and population exchanges and the history of that and how that is related potentially to this issue. We're also going to look at some legal issues related to this issue of the 2019 year of return. Okay, the things that we need to address are multiple things to address here. One of the things that happens with people in life is there's always this idea of the grass always being greener on the other side. And there's a lot of propaganda going on right now, particularly on social media, particularly on YouTube, regarding the grass being greener on the other side, and that other side being the other side of the Atlantic, specifically Africa. And so there is a huge push to encourage a lot of people who identify as African American, Brown Americans, to consider relocating to Ghana, changing citizenship or having joint citizenship with another African nation. And there are all sorts of perks that are presented regarding this. And then there's also this rhetoric about escaping Babylon, which a number of people have decided that the United States represents. Not exactly clear why the United States and no other place represents this, but that's the rhetoric and that's the propaganda that's been going on. So there are a few legal issues that people should consider if they are considering moving abroad, particularly given the political climate, just the culture around the world. Individuals should talk to an attorney before they make these major moves. And so a couple of things that they might want to consider talking with an attorney about are things like citizenship. What happens to the citizenship? What happens to a person's rights as a citizen in the United States when they move abroad? What are the protections? What are the risks? Things like that. Another major issue is the issue of statelessness. Of course, that issue doesn't seem to be an issue on this side of the dynamic. However, you never know what the future may bring. And so when a person moves to another country and they pledge an allegiance to another country, because that's a part of citizenship, you just never know in the future if there will be issues regarding citizenship and statelessness with respect to the first home, which would have been the United States. And so there is a need for many people to consider speaking with legal counsel before making those major decisions for themselves and their families. Now, the African Union has also requested of the diaspora the consideration of contributing to an account that would be a credit union account in a Black credit union. It's unclear where this credit union is exactly, but they are requesting deposits that would equal $1.2 billion per year, if memory serves. And so in addition to that, they are hoping to also get millions of dollars from the various Black churches around the United States each week to be deposited into these accounts for investments in Africa, in development in Africa, and also contributing in terms of manpower. And so what they're asking for is the best and the brightest to return to Africa because of what they've identified as a brain drain that resulted from the transatlantic slave trade, and then the individuals who are continental Africans now actually leaving the continent and often coming to the United States and then often not returning. And so they are now saying that they're experiencing a significant brain drain and that they need the descendants of enslaved Africans and the other descendants to return back and contribute to Africa to build up Africa. Now, if anyone is planning on doing that, again, speaking with an attorney is going to be very important. And some of the issues to speak with an attorney about would be issues like the Logan Act and issues related to treason and subversion, and also the RICO statutes and multi-level marketing issues. And you want to talk with an attorney about these things if this is something that you're considering doing, for a number of reasons. One, it is highly unusual for sovereigns of another country to approach citizens from another sovereign. So the nationals of another sovereign approaching them to have them invest in their economy, have them invest in their governance. Economically. So this is highly unusual behavior. Now, the Logan Act is very, very important because one of the things that people might not understand is when you start doing things like this, which again, this is highly unusual, one of the things that needs to be considered is the relationship that the United States has with any country that a person would be considering funding. And so that's very, very important, and it ties into issues of treason and subversion. And so you want to get a handle on that because there are some laws related to citizens actually doing things in support of other sovereigns that may have interests that are not consistent with the interest of the United States. Or there may be a sovereign that a person they may not be aware of it because you're talking about the entire African Union, but there may be some other sovereigns where there is some major conflict that you may not know about, and you may not know about it until it's too late, where you are looked at as someone who is engaged in some sort of subversion. You also want to look at issues of RICO. There are a lot of issues regarding corruption with a number of African Union countries. And so there was this encouragement for people to pretty much ignore that lower level corruption and focus on other things. However, before you invest yourself in something like this, it is incumbent upon you to perhaps consider seeking legal counsel ahead of time. And again, when people are considering or they're being asked to contribute into some sort of group bank account, you really need to consider the issue, the possibility that it is a multi-level marketing dynamic. And so again, these are things that you need to consider speaking with an attorney about. Now, one of the things that people also might want to give some consideration to is this issue of population exchange. And population exchange is something that has been going on for a very long time historically. One population exchange that people may not be aware of is the one that took place between Greece and Turkey, where the entire populations of two locations were literally exchanged. And a lot of the rhetoric that goes on seems like there is the possibility for a population exchange where there is an expectation or a suggestion that those who identify as African American give up their homeland in America, move somewhere else. And what's been going on historically is the places that African Americans are considering going to in Africa, those are the places that are also sending their citizens. And so you have this dynamic of sort of a voluntary population exchange going on. And of course, one thing someone might ask themselves is, if America is considered Babylon, then why are the people moving to America? from the exact place that Americans are being asked to move to or to consider moving to. So it's an interesting dynamic again, but this is looks like a movement towards a voluntary population exchange where there would be more individuals from the African continent that would come over to the United States, and people from the United States would then move over to the African continent. Same thing with the Caribbean. So it would be individuals from the Caribbean moving to the United States, and then African Americans not really moving to the Caribbean, but still moving to Africa. And just as a refresher for those of you who are trying to recall this treaty and this population exchange with Greece and Turkey, it was from a treaty from 1923, and they basically literally exchanged the populations. The people picked up from their homeland and moved to the space that was previously occupied by the people who were moving to their space. And so literally the people from Turkey moved to Greece and the people from Greece moved to Turkey. And the question people really need to consider is, yes, Africa may be in need of support from many sources, but of course you need to always consider whether or not it's going to be in your best interest to make that move. There are all sorts of benevolent things that people can do outside of, taking on another citizenship or abandoning their current citizenship. But again, if Africa is literally your ancestral homeland, then it is something that, of course, many people are going to give serious consideration to. So if you've been doing your research and from your research, you've discovered that this is your homeland and you know the tribe that your family came from, would be tribes, basically. If you know the tribes that your family came from and you know where they're located now, then that might make perfect sense for many people. And here you can see the people in the caravans being forced to move, and really they're being denaturalized in terms of their actual homeland. And so this was not something that the people necessarily wanted to do. This was a quote unquote diplomatic endeavor. And yes, that diplomatic endeavor was tied to religion and religious differences, which many issues throughout history seem to come down to. One of the things that people might want to think about is the fact that those who are identifying as African American have already undergone a population exchange, and perhaps multiple population exchanges that they don't even know about related to their ancestors. And as you can see on the screen, you have this major population exchange that took place for a couple of hundred years, and coming out of Africa. This may be the true out of Africa theory. And so you did have a number of people coming out of Africa and moving all over the world, going to Europe, going to South America, going to Central America, coming to the United States. And one thing that's really interesting is that after all of these years, no one from Africa has come looking for all of these people that are expected to return to Africa at this point in time. And so it's very interesting timing. But of course, if people see this as their ancestral homeland, then it may make perfect sense for many people, regardless of whether or not family members ever came looking for anyone, or anyone ever came to help those who are the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. There is an interesting dynamic going on where the demand is to offer the services to Africa and to build up Africa. And so it's really an interesting dynamic where there has never been any effort made to lend a helping hand to those descendants of the transatlantic slave trade in America while they are in America. And the only way they're going to benefit from having been a member of the diaspora is to go back to Africa and then contribute to Africa. So it's an interesting dynamic. And as you are aware, there have always been all of these population exchanges going on since America was discovered. Um, and so you already had a population exchange going on for the indigenous people of America with Europeans that came over and also Africans that came over. And so a lot of people actually ignore the fact that the Europeans and the Africans were working in collusion in terms of the whole transatlantic slave process, and in many instances in terms of displacing the indigenous people in this particular land. And so for many of you who have not finished tracing your ancestral roots, the question of moving to Africa, relocating to Africa, it's a questionable endeavor. And so you really need to figure out who you are and where you came from before you jump on any bandwagon in terms of returning to some place that perhaps your ancestors may have never been. And of course, many of you will recall that there was already a population swap. So you just swap one group in and swap another group out. And that's what the Indian Removal Act was all about. It was a matter of swapping people in and swapping people out. The same thing with King Philip's War. There were a number of individuals who were sent to Barbados and sent across the Atlantic as a part of that population swap. So the Pilgrims came over and took that land, and then in order to not have to fight about the land, simply moved those individuals out, enslaved them, and moved them out. And part of that was because the warriors in King Philip's War, and there were several tribes that were involved here, they refused to stop fighting. And so the only way to live peacefully, according to the Pilgrims, was to get those individuals out of the country. Now, again, there are many individuals who do not feel like the United States is their home. They don't feel like it's their home in their heart. This does not feel like their ancestral homeland. They feel as though they are what is known as Africans in America. And for those individuals, again, it makes perfect sense for them to consider moving to Africa. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that people seem to not want to just move on their own. And so there's a push or a pull to insist that those who identify themselves as DOS, descendants of American slavery, descendants of American chattel slavery, there's this push to make them also feel like they need to also move. There are lots of videos and just lots of rhetoric about this issue. And even when individuals like Yvette Carnell says, hey, this is our land, and we're not moving, and they want to stay and get restoration in their land, individuals like Yvette Carnell are considered xenophobic, and they're running away from their blackness and things like that, all sorts of ridiculous things. But what they're being asked to do is basically give up their roots, give up their homeland, and then give up their rights to restoration in this particular land. And so while they identify as having African roots, they do not necessarily see themselves as Africans in America. They see themselves as African American, or they see themselves as, again, descendants of American chattel slavery. And many of them are not interested in going and living in the space where their ancestors are understood as having been enslaved in the first place. It absolutely makes no sense to them, and that is quite understandable. And so one of the things that people really need to consider is, are they really willing to trade places? Are they willing to go into the African Union and allow, there's a caravan coming right now. There are plenty of people who are willing to trade places. And so there is a caravan heading up now with the Honduras flag, you know, the banner there. And there are a number of people in the Caribbean, there are a number of people in Africa, a number of people in Europe that would love to trade places with those who identify as African American, as Indigenous American, as Brown Americans. There are plenty of people who would love to trade places. The question is, do you really want to trade places? And is that in your best interest? You know, again, people tend to think that the grass is always greener on the other side. And when they get over there, they find out that it was not exactly greener, and it might not even be real grass. One of the things that hopefully people will remember from that discussion about Hefan and how that kingdom was taken down, he was married to his enemy's daughter. And also, when you consider what happened with the King Philip situation, there were Confederate Indians who were serving as informants. They were basically double agents sort of people. And those individuals were the cause in many ways of Indigenous people losing their land. And so you have individuals who've been enslaved and people who have lost their land based upon trusting people that look like them. There's an old adage, all skin folk ain't kin folk. And that's very important to remember. And for those of you who learn best through scripture, you can use Matthew 10:36. A man's enemies will be of that man's own household. And basically, what that means is that sometimes the people that you are trusting are the people that are closest to you, that you think are really a part of your community, but they may not be a part of your community. They may just be posing as someone who is a part of your community. They may look like you, but they may not be you. They may not have your best interest at heart. And so you have to be mindful about who you trust, who you put your trust in. When you don't know people, you need to be conscious of that. And so people may come with all sorts of interesting ideas about partnering, and you need to determine if that particular skin folk is really your kinfolk. And remember, because there's so much of this going on YouTube, remember, YouTube is a space that is replete with deception and manipulation, and people engage in all sorts of double dealing. They have all sorts of fake identities, partial names and things like that. And so you never know who these people are. And even when they have full names, you still don't know who these people are. And interestingly, one other thing that you need to note is that a lot of this propaganda, even the African Union stuff, it seems to be isolated, and it seems to be only occurring in social media. And so you're not really hearing anything in mainstream media about any Year of Return or Joseph Project or analogizing African Americans, Indigenous people, analogizing them with the tribes of Israel, because that's a part of this whole dynamic. There's this religious ploy and religious play that is going on with that. And so again, you really don't know these people, and there hasn't been any real public discussion about any of this. And many of these things, things that they're talking about orchestrating, some of those things are things that should take place between governments, and those are not things that individual nationals should be engaging in relation to a totally different sovereign. And when you're talking about the African Union, you're talking about over 50 different sovereigns, and you really don't know the stories related to those sovereigns and their relationship to the home country known as the United States. So in the meantime, you are encouraged to continue with your research, finding out who you are, where your families came from, where your roots are, and what type of restoration you might need in order for you and your community to be made whole. And one of the things that Yvette Carnell brings up quite frequently is this issue of becoming a tribe and being your own tribe and having boundaries around that tribe. And that goes for the descendants of American chattel slavery. That goes for Indigenous people who are trying to get a really good handle around their roots. It is not xenophobic to create boundaries. Boundaries are healthy. Good fences make good neighbors. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon. How could I
Let's go get 'em. I can't get here, you know. Let's go get 'em.